I think just like the courage and just like the spirit and the motivation to do all of it. I mean,
what's courage? There's nothing to lose. Like, there's literally nothing to lose for me.
yeah, no, I would be
It's
very
okay.
scared of getting in front. Me
Yeah.
would be like very afraid of like getting in front of a camera or something. I don't know, or like speaking into it.
I mean, I've embarrassed myself enough as well. Like, I remember when I was like, quote unquote, yelled at by Ayush from Pesto.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was spamming him on the mail because I was 15 then, so मेरे को पता नहीं था कि you shouldn't be spamming people.
Yeah.
So he's like, in all caps, he's like, please stop spamming everything. Okay, my bad, I guess. Okay. Okay, so what's up? Welcome back to another podcast. This time, the podcast we have Amal Vats. Welcome to the podcast, Amal.
Hi Yash, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, there's this ritual that we do on the podcast where we ask the guests to introduce themselves because I'm not that good at introductions. So,
Okay.
who is Amal Vats? What does he do?
Well, I'll just keep this short. So, I'm Amal. I work with Blume Ventures in their investment team. Been at Blume for close to 2 years. Essentially, we sort of like are a C-stage investment firm. We evaluate early stage startups and invest with them and partner with them and work with them. And yeah, I mean, I think like the reason I'm here on the podcast is also because while working with Blume, I wrote this report called the Indus Valley Report along with Sajid Pai. And I think the reception's been decent. I'm guessing that's the reason I'm here. So yeah, I think that's about it.
Awesome. Okay, so we are in Bangalore right now. I landed like today, and you're in Bangalore since how long?
Almost 2 years.
How's Bangalore treating you?
I love Bangalore, to be honest. I think more so because of the people than anything else. I like the weather is great, of course. Like I mean, that's a short thing. But apart from that, I think just have a lot of people I know here from my college, from my my workplace that I know here of, and I think Bangalore just has also got this like really different energy where people tend to mix in quite a bit, and I think the city has become a lot about the startup ecosystem, right? And it's just like so full of energy. I think it just like feels great to be here. And like I mean, just I think being in the middle of like a brewing pot where like I mean every bit of new tech that comes like anywhere in the world, you have something that's happening around it in Bangalore as well. So I think just like feels very special, and just like to be able to contribute to it in any manner, I think it just feels great.
Because I landed today and this is my first time in Bangalore, and I met like two really interesting people in the same cafe. So I met Dr. Shiva, who started the Manipal Hospital. And I met a roommate who's starting his own Web3 thing.
Right.
Is this normal to meet like founders, people who are doing stuff like every time, like in a cafe, or is it not?
I think actually in quite a few areas. So I mean, if you go to any of the third waves in Kormangla or Indranagar or in HSR.
HSR is Alasuru?
Yeah. So I mean, there is no chance that you will not find a founder or a VC sitting there. And like I'm talking about the hours of like say 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. in the evening. For sure you will find like either a founder or someone who works in a startup or someone in the VC who's there, right? So you're right, you tend to meet quite a few people. And I think it's just been like 2 years for me here, and I also know like I mean like quite a few people. I think so like the more years you stay here, I think the circle just like sort of like multiplies as much as possible, right?
How's like the party talk like? Like do you walk into parties and people are just pitching or something? Not because you're a VC, but in general when you walk into parties, is that what's the conversation about, or it's really normal?
Now that I think about it, I think I mean like during most parties you will end up talking about work. Like one, because like we're all talking about working professionals, right? So I mean like work becomes like 40 to 50% of their lives, like on a 24-hour basis. So I think they do tend to talk about that. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, I think like because the city is buzzing with energy, like because of these people, and these people are all like very motivated, right? Someone who's a founder, she or he is very motivated to just like make sure their like venture works, right?
Sure.
Someone who just like works in a startup, right? Like whether it's an early stage or a late stage thing, they're all putting in an intense number of hours and just like taking on so much responsibility to make sure their thing succeeds, right? So I think just like because of that, people do end up talking quite a bit. So in every party or every social gathering, you will hear about work.
That's interesting, because in Mumbai it's the other way. I mean, it's not the other way around, but for the most part you'll find like social media personnel like in any like cafe or something, because they're usually shooting or something like that.
Right.
That's pretty cool. So how is that different from your hometown? Like coming to Bangalore, and it turns out you went to Luxembourg as well.
Yeah.
Talk me through that.
Okay, so I think might as well just like expand it to other cities I stayed in as well, right?
Sure,
So I mean, like a big part of my family comes from Delhi, so I know Delhi quite well. I've spent like 7 years in Bombay, so I know Bombay quite well. Now Bangalore and Dehradun, where I come from, and quite a few places. I grew up in UP as well when I was growing up, and then there's like Luxembourg, entirely different. Right?
Sure.
I think I mean all of these cities are very very different. In terms of the kind of conversations that happen, maybe they are similar to some extent in Delhi and Mumbai. I think majorly because they're all like, I mean, very, in my view, very cosmopolitan cities, and most of at least like my social circle will be limited to people who've like they might have grown up there as well, but they're also people who've come in from different parts of India to those cities, right? So I think the kind of conversation in Delhi and Mumbai are like a little bit similar but very different from other places, right? Dehradun is a very interesting city. I think it's just like really on that path where the whole government's spending a lot to make sure it becomes like one of the more notable cities in India, whether it's spending on tech parks or something else, right? Just like the whole infra bit as well. So I think there's a very interesting city that way. Luxembourg was just like very different. I think
it's very expensive, is it not?
It is very expensive. But I think like the difference there is life in Europe versus like life in India, maybe. I think it's different in the sense that people care a lot more about what happens outside of their work in places like like a Luxembourg maybe, because your work day ends at 5, right? Like, and after that people usually go outside, they meet up different people, they outside till like 9 or 10, and then they go back home, right? Weekends is like mostly like one day spent outside, one day spent just like at their homes with their families. I think India, at least like cities like Bangalore, Mumbai or Delhi are like very different that way. It's a lot more about work. I don't think people spend as much time maybe with like their families as like, I mean, as I saw happening in Luxembourg maybe. So I think just like very different cultures exist in both the cities, and that sort of like also shapes up how people tend to think about their lives and to behave about everything. And I think that's a major difference.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so you were from IIT and you went in Kota.
Yeah.
How is that phase of life like from Kota to exiting IIT?
Got it. So Kota was 2 years, IIT was 5 years, like it was a 5-year course. I would never want to relive my 2 years in Kota. I would happily relive like my 5 years in campus, right? So I think, I mean, Kota was, so while I understand the significance of it, I think, so I went there to prepare for IIT JEE. And hence there was like one single objective, right, which is like to get through IIT JEE. Also, the other bit of context is that my elder brother also went to Kota.
Did he go to IIT?
Sorry?
Did he also go to IIT?
Yes, he went. He also went to an IIT, and so he's like 5 years elder to me, right? So I mean, like when he went, like I also thought, like, okay, sure, I also go. So as I said, like just like one single objective, so you don't tend to, I would say, develop in as many spheres of life as someone who's just finishing their school should, right? It's like a very unilateral sort of like development in my view, which like can't be great. It helps to achieve an objective, sure. So I mean, so that's why I mean, like it's fine, right? But like when it comes to college, I think because I went to a place like Bombay. Also, I mean, so just like when I was doing my own counseling, right? Had the option to go to Delhi, had the option to go to Roorkee, and like I mean, pretty much like all IITs, but like Delhi, 1200. So
you could get anywhere basically.
Yeah. Almost. So and I liked physics, right? So I knew like it was either going to be physics or a very related branch. So I could go there and I could get that in like any of the IITs.
Sure.
So Delhi is where a big part of my family lives, and Roorkee is where like a big part of my mom's side of the family lives, right? So after discussing with my elder brother, I realized like both of these places should be out of my sort of like counseling sort of like preferences, because he said that, and he'd observed that with his batchmates, right? Like people who live close to home also had the tendency to like go back home every weekend and all of that. So people just like spend a lot of time with their own folks. But I think the kind of atmosphere like a college life gives is just like very different. The kind of camaraderie you can develop with your friends, or the kind of different things you can explore, just like tinkering or anything, right? It's just like way too many things. So Bombay was interesting because we had no family friends, we had no relatives in Bombay. So just like a complete clean slate for me. So when I went to Bombay, I knew like I had to make friends and all of that, right? So I think just like a great bunch of 5 years, to be honest. I think it gave me some much needed social skills. It helped me explore very different parts of my personality. Helped me pick up different things as well, which I maybe like wouldn't have picked up, or like at least where I was coming from, would have the chance to pick those things up. And I think just like going to a place like Bombay, which has got like such illustrious alumni, I think it's just like it's a great sense of community and all as well, right? So I think I would like happily spend those 5 years in in Bombay like over and over again.
Interesting. Okay, so last question before we get into the meat of the conversation. So a lot of people have misconceptions about what VCs actually do and where the money comes from, basically, because they think, okay, so they just get their own money and put it in, but that's actually not that. It's not that easy. It's a bit more complex. So for, let's say, a layman, what does a VC do, and what's your job there?
Okay, so without getting into the complexity, there's like different kinds of VCs and all that. So just like keep it very typical. So a typical venture capital firm invests in what we call startups, right? Those startups could be at different stages of their life. We are also talking about startups, like for example, there's a founder who has just like thought about something, like they've been dealing with the problem statement for long, they've thought about some solution, and they want to see if the experiment is worth it, right? Like if the experiment works, there are enough takers for it, right? So so basically, let's just like try to think about where all startups could need money, right? To like just like build any business. So as I said, like if you have to run some initial bits of experiments, right, you need some money there. Suppose if the experiments succeed, right, then you would think that okay, like and you would have done experiment with like perhaps like a makeshift solution, right?
Like a very basic MVP.
Exactly, right? Now what you might want to do is that you might want to develop like a more sophisticated version of it, right? That also needs money, right? Then once you have like a better version of it, you might want to think about start selling it to more people, right? Selling it also needs money. You get money after, but to sell it also you need money, right? The resources and everything. Once you start once you're able to start selling it to a few people, then you might want to think about okay, like multiple options, like either I can just like sell this same thing to like a larger section of like customers, or maybe I can just like also develop something else which my customers need. Both of these things again require money, right? Essentially to grow you need money for that as well. And then like any bit of expense that you can imagine, right? Now all of this would become very difficult if the founders would have to spend their own money, because all of this requires a lot of money, right? That's one. Two, if you bank on traditional sources of capital, which is like something like a bank or like another financial institution, they typically need like a lot of financial history before they can trust their money with you, right? So hence what happens is, to sort of like help financing this sort of like complex and like non-traditional situation, venture capital steps in, right? So we help with all the parts of like any startup journey that I just talked about. Could be financing the earlier set of experiments, could be financing hiring, could be financing growth of that startup, or just like anything else, right? So that's what venture capital does. And to your question, like I mean, it's not our own money, like it can be, to be honest, but like typically we get money from what we call as LPs, which are like limited partners, and sort of we get money from them. They trust us with their money. Because they think that we have what it takes to give them better returns. Then we take this money and deploy them in like multiple startups, and depending on how the startup does, we might get some returns somewhere, we might not get returns somewhere, and then whatever money we get back, we give a share of it back to our LPs, keep some for ourselves, and that's how the industry like works in layman terms.
Got it. Okay, so where does the report section step in? Like why are because I've seen this a lot, like a lot of other VC firms have putting out reports. Why does this happen, and does this really does this have a role in your investing, like actual investing?
Got it.
Do you refer to your own reports before investing in a company?
Okay, so let me expand just report to say any of the thesis reports you put out there, or something else as well, right? Like any sort of like educational material you might put out there in the public, right? Let me just like expand your question to that. Now, with that context, let's just like think about who are our customers. When I say our, like I mean who's a VC customer, right? It is our LPs, who like basically who are our customers, it is the founders who are our customers, and it's the general ecosystem as well, right? Could be like other VCs, could be just people who are working in the startup ecosystem, who are not founders necessarily, but just like who are working there, right? So like any one of these, to be honest, are our direct customers, right?
Sure.
Now what we try and do for like each of these bits is that, say for example, if it's like an LP, right? Suppose there's an LP who's sitting outside India, say they're sitting in New Zealand somewhere, and they might not have an exact idea of how things are in the Indian startup ecosystem, right? They have money to deploy, right? And they're looking for diversification opportunities. Putting out a report which showcases which sort of like showcases that we have some sort of IP, we have some thinking skills, helps attract them to us, right? So it's a good way to do some LP marketing, right? When it comes to founders, any bit of thesis reports you put out there, right?
Or use for founders? It's a very good use for founders.
It's a use for founders, one. I mean, they might just like get some bit of info there, right? That's like the best use of our report. Also, secondly, what happens in all of these thesis reports is that we also typically tend to talk about sectors we like, right? Even in a particular sector, like what sectors we like, where we think future opportunities are, where we think some trends are, and all of that, right? And what that also helps us with is very focused thinking, right? If we think that a particular subsector or a particular sector does not have a lot of opportunity to make something in the next 10 years, then we tend to, because like, I mean, there's like a million opportunities to invest, right? Like, I mean, to be honest, like every year at Blume we receive close to 4,000 pitches. We can't invest in them, pitches, right?
Like just the emails or like actual pitches where you...
No, like emails, and then there's like a whole funnel, right? But so pitches could be like the first bit of interaction, could be an email, could be something else as well, right? But we might end up investing in just about 10 to 15 of them, right? So 4,000 down to 10 to 15 is like a lot of effort. So what we can't do is do a deep dive on every startup that comes to our door. Instead, what we might do is we might have some preformed views in the sectors, and that sort of like also helps us narrow down opportunities which we like, right? Or there are also some opportunities where we just like we don't want to invest. So for example, at Blume, we don't do real money gaming, right? So it's a mandate from our LPs, for example. So hence, like just like putting that out there in the public, like also helps save founders time, right? That like these guys are not interested in this sector, why even write to them?
Is this called like investment thesis or something?
Exactly, right? So all of these, like to founders, coming back to your question, is like a good way to tell them how we're thinking, what we're thinking, and all of that, right? So I think it just like makes for a good bond right up front. And I think ecosystem, it like, I mean, I hope it's of use to them, like because like if people find something interesting in their reports, if they want to deep dive into something, if they want to reach back to us and talk about something, it's just like all great returns for us, right? So I think that's the broad agenda behind which like VCs invest in like any of these educational materials.
Sure. So it basically saves you a lot of time. So
that, and like as I said, like this marketing, this like attracting LPs, all of that.
And so just off the bat, right? This might sound very dumb, but doesn't that induce a little bit of bias in your heads, like your own reports, like something like that? Like while investing, like,
fair enough. So it's a good question. So to be honest, I think if I talk about like a typical, like someone who's like a good VC, they'll also make sure. And okay, now I'll just like bring a little bit of context here as well about like what I do, right? So I work with an early stage venture capital firm. What that means is we invest in seed stage firms, which means that most of the firms that we invest in, either they've just started their operations, they started with the first few bit of experiments, or they have some revenue coming in, or essentially they're like in their early stages, right? There, the founder tends to be like a lot more important than, I mean, there might also be cases where like we invest in a founder when the founder just has like a paper napkin plan, right? Nothing else apart from that.
Like this is pre-revenue, pre-everything.
This is pre-revenue, pre-everything. So in that case, it would be almost like, I mean, for lack of a better word, foolish if we don't step outside of our biases, right? Outside of our thesis, because I genuinely believe, like, I mean, like great founders can just like go across all ties and just like flip every bit of thesis that is out there in the market to make sure they can build something very meaningful, right? So to your question, we always have to be like awake and like aware about that. But that notwithstanding, I think it really helps us to focus down as well, right? Because as I said, like coming down from 4,000 pitches to like 10 to 15 investments, it just like helps serve our fund mandate, as well as just make sure that like we as a fund and even as an individual, we do keep developing focus and sort of like strength over a particular area, right?
Got it.
So I think that just like in the better run might make us better investors and better partners to founders.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So you brought up a term called good VC, right? So what according to you is like a good VC?
That's, I don't know.
It's a very broad question, but
yeah, I mean,
to a certain degree, because I read something a couple of days ago about like shady things Indian VCs do, which everybody knows about.
Yeah.
Did you read that tweet?
I did.
You did. So I'll put that up on the screen if that's fine.
That's okay. Yeah.
So what do you think about that? Like, does that really happen? Like, is it common?
Okay, so like answering your latter question first, because to be honest, I don't have an answer to the first question. I think like typically VC careers are supposed to be very long careers, and you only start to get proper feedback based learnings once you spend at least 4 to 5 years. So 2 years is a very small time for me to like just like adequately gauge and judge that. That being said, to answer your latter question, I think so if I'm not wrong, you referred to the tweet where it's sort of like said that there is information exchange and all of that, right? That's I think the central point of the tweet. I think folks who are in the startup ecosystem, so there are founders who were VCs before, there are VCs who were founders before, and like there's a whole crisscross, right? So there's never really a divide as such, like between like VCs and startups. So everyone knows this happens. Now, is it good? No, right? I think what really helps to do is if you establish clear guidelines up front, right? So what might happen, for example, is that like, I was like working along with a colleague on an edtech thesis last year, right? So we do tend to talk to founders to just like also help build our views, validate our views, our hypothesis from founders, right? But what we tend to do is that we straight up say to them that like, hey, we are working on this XYZ thesis and we would like to get your views, right?
Got it.
So what I mean to say is that I think as long as you can establish clear guidelines, it's not really a problem. Even if I'm investing in a particular company, and if I'm just like doing diligence, talking to other companies in that sector, I tend to just like say upfront that like, boss, there is a company I'm evaluating. I can't name the company, but they're in your sector, right? So, and I have these questions. If you have any constraints about some questions you can't answer, that's fine, right? But I would just like still love to get learnings from you. So I think that's the right way to go about it. But I mean, I think like what you're referring to, I think it does happen, right? It's unfortunate. Like, I mean, like no one would want proprietary data getting outside.
Sure.
So whenever it happens, it's very unfortunate.
That's sad. So is there a little bit of FOMO in the VC space? Because I talked to an angel investor called Dr. Malpan, and he said the VC space thrives on FOMO. Okay, this guy is investing in this company, I should invest, or else I miss out on the train. Is it really something that happens? How have you experienced that?
Okay, so in terms of like whether I have experienced it, I don't think so. As I said, like I think it's just been 2 years. Once I spend like 2-3 more years, I'll know for better. But at least so far, no. And also like I mean like Blume typically does like very few investments like out of FOMO, right? We tend to make sure our conviction's good, it's strong, and sort of like comes from good first principles. So like I mean I don't think there are any FOMO based investments, at least in the 2 years I've been here, right? Like and like I don't think I've heard of any even before that. But to your question, I think there is FOMO in the industry, but I think like it's important to understand where FOMO comes from, right? Where you say like you don't want to miss out on an opportunity, right? Which is like a particular investment opportunity. Sure. It could come from either the fact that hey, like there's a particular sector that you think is really going to pick up in the next few years, and you don't want to miss out on investing in that sector, right? Or there is like a really good founder you've heard about from like multiple people, right? People who work with that founder, just like hearsay, right? And you feel that it would be just great to work with this founder, right? Not just like invest in them, but like VCs, or like I mean, investing is just one part of VC, right? But like you tend to then work with the founders on their companies, sort of like deal problems along with them, which are problems they want our help on and everything, right? So you as a VC, as a good VC, also want to work with like as like good a founder as you can, right? So there's maybe like a fear of missing out on a particular founder, or you might have a very strong conviction on that founder, right? Or maybe there is an opportunity, a particular problem space, right? And you have like a really strong conviction on that problem space, that like, boss, I think something really needs to be built here, right? I think that's where FOMO comes from, right? But if there is FOMO, FOMO, I for sure is like rooted out of some bit of conviction.
Sure.
But if it comes just because, hey, there is this XYZ VC which is doing the deal, so let us also do the deal, right? I think that's wrong. Also like to each their own, like different funds have different strategies. But it's something that we never try and preach it to.
So it almost runs on that, because if a VC leads a round, a lot of people just come they participate in the round, right?
Correct.
So how does that happen, right? So let's say a VC is leading a round. Like when do the other people join in?
Okay, so I think what happens is that like if a founder is building something and they're raising a round, right? They tend to talk to like a lot of people, right? They might be talking to like a few founders who are there in the space or in a related space, to get some sort of learnings from them, right? Or they might be talking to smaller VCs, bigger VCs all at once. So hence, like when a round is being constructed, you might have someone who's leading the round, but hey, there's like also 5 founders you talk to, right? Who might be angel investors, and you go back and tell them that like XYZ fund has said that they want to come and participate in a round, right? So why would they also not want to pilot? Exactly, right? Because what really happens is that this whole, so it's an interesting lens to think about the whole bit of fundraising and all of that, right? What happens is, as a VC, for example, or as an investor, I am paying the founder some amount of money to get access to their time, right? Inversely, a founder is giving up stake in their company to someone else to get time from that particular person, right? Now, if, say, for example, Yash is a founder and Abhay is like a grade 2-time founder, right? Suppose. So what might just happen is that you want Abhay's time because you want his help in your company or something else, right? And a good way, and Abhay is busy, right? So a good way of doing that is like to make sure that Abhay is like has invested something.
Has taken.
Exactly, right? So this is also why people take angel investments, for example, because then they get access to their time, their learnings, their knowledge, right? So I think that's how like all of this happens.
The better version of mentoring to a certain degree.
Exactly, right? So I wouldn't say this bit is like called FOMO investing. I think it's just like more about, okay, I mean this is like purely an investment opportunity, right? So I mean, could be FOMO, could be something else, but I think like ideally like the root of all FOMO should be coming from some bit of conviction.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so what goes around while building an actual report? Like, from what I figured, the report is sourced from multiple other researchers. So what happens during that? Like, how many people are involved in it? How long did it take to build this year's report? How is it different from the previous one?
Okay, so I'll just like talk about the whole journey, right? Like how we also came to the concept of the report. So, so in US, I think like it's actually been a couple years since the report's been published now. So there's a report called the Merrymaker report, right? Merrymaker Internet Trends, and so she was, I think, an analyst at Goldman Sachs in some point in time, and then she later turned a VC. And what she used to do every year was that just like she was a data geek. And she used to comb through multiple sets of data to just like try and find some interesting bits, right? Which could like tell some interesting stories or some interesting observations. So she used to put that out every year. And Sajid and I were sort of inspired by that, right? So we thought, let's try and do something specifically for India, sort of like a Merrymaker for India, right? She was doing it majorly on US, and some bit of global or sort of like analysis as well, but majorly US, right? And US has a lot of ground level data. India doesn't, except we do not know about that till we actually started out, right? So we tried talking to a lot of people, tried like sort of like finding lots of data points. We realized it's just like India is just massively data stuffed. So we thought that publishing a report around just data points would not be that fruitful. So we thought, okay, I mean like we have some bit of exposure to like a few good founders, like we have an exposure to a whole startup ecosystem, and I mean like we've already gone through quite a bit of reports. So might as well just like try and compile perspectives and interesting stories from everywhere and try and put it down in the form of a report, right? So that's how sort of we reached to this sort of a structure of the Indus Valley Report. And what we did last time, which was like not this year, last year, which was the first edition of the report, was essentially because we thought we were catering to a global audience, right? As I said, like LP marketing was like one of the reasons behind it, right? So we thought, okay, let's just like try and introduce India, right? And talk about different stories, different interesting points in India. Then we talked about the Indus Valley, which is like our moniker for the startup ecosystem. We introduced that, right? And then we talked specifically about how Indus Valley had fared in the year 2021, right? So we made this report, we put it out. And we thought, okay, like, I mean, the reception was fair. So we thought, okay, let's just like try and make it into an annual thing, right? So, except when we went about it last year, we can't introduce India again. We can't introduce the startup because it's been done, right? So we just like thought, okay, let's keep one section where we again talk about different interesting stories about India, not introducing India as such. And then we could also talk about how the Indus Valley fared in the year 2022, right? And then we kept one section open, which is like some bit of interesting, again, like stories, conclusions we found, right? That's how we went about the report structure last year. And in terms of like how the efforts went behind it, so Sajid and I worked on it. We spent almost 2 months into the whole report. And Sajid and I, and then there were also a couple interns who was working with. Very thankful for like their efforts. And so, I mean, like we went through a lot of reports, found interesting data points from like wherever we could. Any data point that told us that sort of like showed some comparison of one interesting thing versus another, or one interesting thing over time. We just thought, okay, we could get some conclusion from it, right? So captured all those data points, talked to many people, founders, operators, like just like respected people in the industry, what have you, and then compiled all of their viewpoints into this report.
So fine. So what has been peculiar about India that you have seen after making these reports? Like, is there something very specific that you figured out which you never thought existed? Like in terms of data points, in terms of user behavior, how people spend money, something which has just stuck in your head and you couldn't find an answer to, like why it works like that.
Okay, so I would say, I think like, so the report, this year's report was 125 pages. I think 100 pages of those are at least filled about things I did not know about, right? So there's way too many examples. But like, I mean, it's just like one of the first examples in the deck actually, right? So we just like tried to break up India's GDP, and we tried to understand what sort of like composes India's GDP, and to make sense of it, we tried comparing it against China's, right? So there's this like term which is called your essentially gross development function in a way, right? So what it does is sort of like, I mean, it talks about productive assets, right? For example, if you invest money into building a highway, right, or into building a hospital, right? So all of that counts under that specific function, right? So we just like saw how much of it is how much of it composes India's GDP and how much of it composes China's GDP, right? And there was a big difference. It contributes to around 43% of China's GDP, but just around 30% of India's GDP.
What do you think is that?
Sorry?
What do you think is that?
Okay, so that happens because so all of this is essentially like capital investment, right? It needs to come either from the government or it needs to come from the private sector, right? What's happened in the last 10 to 15 years is that like the private sector has been contributing, but not a lot, right? And hence it comes down to the government. Now think about the kind of country India is, right? It's a country that's dependent more on services as compared to industry and manufacturing, right? So that's where most of the government's money goes, right? And not into this. Then India is also a very welfare-based state, right? You've got so many schemes and like so many things to just like make sure that like everyone has some level of economic independence. So a lot of India's money also goes there, right? So hence like the overall allocation to this specific part of the GDP has been lesser than ideally it should have been, right? And if the government can only spend that much, then that means that like private sector needs to step up more, right? And we're expecting that to happen in the next 3 to 4 years. So maybe this function would just like increase up a little bit. But that was just like one of the things that we came across, right? So it's like multiple interesting bits that like I did not at least know about before.
In other terms, how does China compare with India? like in terms, I think you have mentioned population in the report, you've mentioned a bunch of things. We'll pull up each and every slide you mentioned here. It would be great if you just mention the slide number as well, if you remember off the part of the topic.
Unlikely, but but
I see it's like in the initial quarter of the report from what I'm gauging.
So, how is China different from India? Okay, so I think like one is definitely in terms of like how the whole report's composed by in itself, right? So by in terms of like how the whole GDP sort of like is comprised of, China is heavier on manufacturing as against services. It's the other way around for India, right? China, I think, is like also very independent and rich in terms of natural resources. Which India might not be in all parts, right? Which means like it affects your imports and exports, right? So that's again a different thing. And then I think just like China really pressed the pedal from like, I mean, in the last century, to be honest, right? In the latter part of the last century, and what that helped do was they developed their infra, they developed their, for example, say. Let's just like talk about something which is tangible, right? Say, for example, e-commerce, right? E-commerce requires a very, very good logistics sort of like network, right? China, even though it's a vast country, has got a great logistics network. You can, I mean, like the ease of returning a product in China, like if it's
better than India,
is much better than India, right? Which is like numerous implications. So, I mean, a reason as to why video commerce is not succeed that well in India as against China is like it also owes to logistics, right? Because like people don't trust products and like people might order something but they don't like it back, right? They want to send it off again, they want to return it. It's easier to do that in China as against India. So it's like multiple things that like go back to how much essentially China has invested in its infra and in its productive assets, right? So I think today if there's a major differentiator, perhaps that's it.
Got it. So this is, if someone has ever read the Indus Valley Report, you know how these guys have segregated India into parts and how people spend money. So can you just brush through that so that we can get into that?
Sure. You mean India 1 to 3?
Yeah, India 1 to 3, India 1 to 5.
Okay, got it. So, that's been a Blume way of looking at things. And what we think is that India is not like one homogeneous India. It is composed of like what in our view is like 3 parts, right? Like one's India 1, one is India 2, one is India 3, right? And it helps to think about them like in terms of drawing parallels to understand them better. What we think is, for example, let's talk about India 1, who've got like a higher paying power, right? And we think that there's perhaps roughly 120 million people or so in this category, roughly 30 million households who have perhaps like an average per capita income of roughly $12,000. So that comes down to roughly 10 lakhs rupees or so. And that drives around like $1.5 trillion of GDP in India out of the overall $3.5 trillion, right? So it's a major part of it. Just less than 10% of the population, but like almost half of the GDP, right? So that's one. And even within this India 1, we think there is like one very small population, just like around 25 million people or so, whose average per capita income is closer to 25 lakhs or so, right? 25 lakhs or so. And they spend like even a lot more disproportionately, right? So it's easier to think about this part as a Taiwan perhaps, right? As a Taiwan, right? So that's one. So that's India 1 for us. And a lot of the products that you see today that are being built by startups, consumer ones, are focused more on India 1, right? So Cred, for example, focuses on India 1, right? You've like, I mean, Netflix, your Amazon and your Flipkart, they're also majority part of it comes from an India 1. Netflix, for example,
Amazon
for them too, absolutely.
The major income is driven by India 1.
Exactly, right? Something like a Netflix, great example, right? Like India 1, purely an India 1 product. So we've got India 1 there. Then what we have is India 2, which is the next 300 million people, whose perhaps I would say average per capita income is closer to $3,000 perhaps, right? And the kind of products that are for this section of India is like much different, right? So like a share chat is like an India 2 product, right? It's I mean it's used more out of your metro and tier 1 cities and just like much more beyond that, right? Meesho, for example, started off as an India 2 product, right? They were trying to bring on resellers who were based in these tier 2, tier 3 cities, and they were doing e-commerce, right? So then you've got those sort of products as well. And then what we have is something which is called India 3, right? Where you've got the remaining close to like like 1 billion people,
Yeah, a lot.
and their average per capita income is closer to $1,500, right? So that's just like about a lakh, 1.2 lakhs or so, and their spending power is much less, right? So in our view, what we do is like whenever there's a consumer product or something else, it helps to think of their impact or their interaction with India 1, 2, 3 differently as against to an overall India, right? Because what really happens when you think about India 1, 2, 3 is you might think that like, oh, there are like 1 billion users in India, right? Or if there's like 800 million internet users, the potential base is 800 million people, right? But that's not true, right? They might be using it, they might not be paying up for it.
Sure.
The real payers are just like about 100 million people, right? So I think that's where like our thinking comes from. That's exactly what like the.
Let's talk about the apps that are built specifically for India 2, right? For example, let's say Meesho, India 2, India 3.
Yeah.
Let's say ShareChat. So look, if you look at the numbers, they don't really make that much money, and looking at the ad cost, it's not that much. So in turn, they don't end up making a lot of money. Whereas a Netflix would make a bunch more money with less amount of users. Yeah. Or let's say Instagram would make more money with less amounts of users because the users on Instagram are fairly richer.
Yeah.
So why do VCs invest in such companies? Like, what's the incentive?
Okay. So in my perspective, I think like essentially VCs invest in startups to underwrite certain hypotheses, right? Now, the hypothesis for any tier 2 like consumer product, right, and at least like when all of these started way back then, right, would just have been that there's a big enough audience to go after, right? Ads have been working in different, like at least in a different section of consumers. It might also start to work here, right? That might have been the hypothesis. Or just like think about the scale, right? Like the number of users ShareChat has in India is more than the number of Instagram users, right? So essentially, I mean, and in all consumer products, though perhaps like the biggest moat is like always distribution, right? The more number of consumers you have access to, like the bigger moat, right? I think like the hypothesis might also just have been that like if we do get access to a large number of users, if we make this the preferred way to talk or to chat in India 2, India 3, and like perhaps even India 1, then maybe there's some goal to strike there, right? Sure. So that could have been the original hypothesis, like which like any venture, like which that particular VC fund might have just like invested in, right? So I think at the end of it all, this is what all investments come down to, that we're all underwriting certain experiments, right? Now it might just so have happened that like at least for India so far, we might not have seen like a lot of great money minting like startups already, right? However, I don't think that like that's like a definitive statement. Right. I think just like it'll just take more time, right? Essentially, I like to think of India 2 as perhaps like a maybe like an India which is like not mature yet, right? In the sense that it will take like a few years to get there in terms of either spending power or in terms of just like the overall ecosystem, right? When I say ecosystem, let's just like talk about, say, for example, e-commerce, right? Sure. In like how it happens in India 2 versus India 3. So as I said before, I think like one thing one thing all e-commerce firms have to solve for, trust, right? Then if you think from the perspective of an India 2 customer, they have to keep in mind the kind of product assortments like an India 2 consumer might need, right? Maybe that needs to improve. Or how the fulfillment happens. Essentially, maybe they also want deliveries in like a day or two, right? But like they might take sometimes 7 days, right? If it's taking 7 days, I might just like go to a nearby store and buy it instead, sure, right? Or maybe the whole experience of e-commerce, right? Like maybe they want the returns process to be better, or just like the overall experience, right? Or maybe they also want some sort of like localized products there, right? Like people. Sure. They also like so I mean like different example, but like stage 1 of our portfolio companies, if you've heard of them. So essentially what they do is they are sort of like a media production company, something like a Netflix, right? But they make those pieces of content like TVs, like episode series, right? Or like movies and all, for regional Indian dialects. So they started with Haryanvi, right? And they're making content there. They've got a very good user base. Sure. People who pay, right? So maybe people are also looking for localization in like all of these bits, right? So I think all of these aspects will take time. The whole logistics ecosystem needs to get better. People need to slowly develop trust over the kind of products these e-commerce firms are selling, right? As soon as that starts to happen, maybe you'll also see a similar behavior like in India too, as you see in India one right now. That's my view, right? So like, to your point, I don't think like these firms will always be non-investable. There's like just like maybe like a certain number of more years they need to get or like to become that mature, right? I think that's what is needed right now. So hence patience.
So I just had an idea in my head, like right off the bat. What if India too is like a transition state, which will eventually transport a bunch of users to India 1? Like, is that something you look at? What do you think about this? Right off the bat.
Okay, so I think so one like crucial thing, right? Like India to India 1 is like are not regions. They're like spending power, right?
Sure.
So when you take transport, you mean just like essentially people having their spending power increased.
Yes.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, like it is so. Which is like, I mean, how I described India 1, 2, 3. There is a major income inequality that exists in India. It is one, either it is bound to slowly like get smaller, or you will have founders who are developing products to solve for that income inequality, right?
Got it.
Naturally, also you might have a lot of people who are moving from India 2 to India 1. Yes. Right? People find better jobs, people move cities, people find a certain skill at which they become good at, and so on and so forth. So you will always see people moving from India 2 to India 1, right? As soon as they do that, as you like to your point, the behavior starts to change visibly, so right. So I think that is one thing which will keep happening, and more so, even if this, it's not like this migration will happen 100% in like a limited number of years, right? But maybe till those number of 3, 4, 5 years, you will also have like a better ecosystem overall for like India 2 or India 3, right? So I think that's where I see things heading. And like a lot of the same push will come from startups in terms of developing products for them.
From what I just thought, I think migrating is also very difficult, right? Because looking at income equality and I think it's said that to move from poverty to like to a decent thing, it takes at least like 7 generations, something like that. Could be. Yeah. I think the segregation will still remain there for the most part. So I think that's not like a transition state.
Yeah.
So is it okay the media platforms are built for the India 2/India 3 ecosystem? Can they never be profitable? Because looking at if you think about operational charges, like they're taking so much server space, like a lot of, and also making content is easier there, so they need much more server space and whatever and all that. So and making the ad spend, it's very less. So can they never be profitable?
I don't think so. So as I said, like I think like as long as those startups now have distribution, right? There's many things they can do with it. And like I mean, also like to my previous point, I think is in my mind is just about like the ecosystem becoming more and more mature. So all they have to manage to do is like stay afloat, right? I heard this podcast by Mukesh, who was the founder of Myntra and then Cult, right? The Cure Fit group. So his point also was that like in his viewpoint, all founders have to do is like try and stay alive, right? As long as any founder can do that for a decent number of years, they will see the tide turning in some way or the other, right? So I think that similar thing also applies to all of these social consumer startups or media startups who are building for India 2 or India 3. It's not about that they can never become profitable. Like the startups who've spent quite a bit of money to get to the distribution levels they have now, if they can just like hold on to that or start to sell a different kind of product which their consumer bases also need, maybe that's the way to stay alive, right? Or just like growing very slowly in terms of user base from this point onwards is the way to go about it. I don't know what it really is, right? But like I really don't think that like only non-profitable businesses can be built in that space.
Tell me if I understand it. So for what I gauge from this, they're saying they have to be alive for long enough so that the users develop some trust, they develop some maturity. So eventually they have some money spending possibility. Okay, that's that. Okay, so question on that. How do you make sure that India 2 and India 3 start spending online? Because that's because in the report we just see that it's not happening that often. It's only a very less amount of people even in India spending online. So how do we induce trust? How do we make sure they start scanning QR codes? Start using Google Pay?
Right. So actually, interesting point. I think like Google Pay is like a very good way to like kickstart all of that, and it's been happening. Now the problem with or like the complexity with India is that like there are like in any society there's like always like elements who are also looking to misuse any certain piece of technology, right? So I know that there are like also so I've heard of this one scam which happens in like a few areas in UP and like Delhi, right?
Yeah.
Those places specifically because I've heard first-hand experiences from those places, right? That so I mean, like if you go to a typical kirana shop, right? Like a lot of them have their QR codes just like pasted outside the shop wall, right? They say that like, if you're buying something, just like scan the QR code, pay, then go, right? What's happened in a few cases is that like just before the shop opens in the morning, someone comes and puts their own QR code there, right? Okay. Now, I mean, as a shopkeeper, you are still asking customers to pay using that QR code, right? And as a customer, I am paying money, just that the shopkeeper isn't getting it, right? Makes sense. I mean, like there's like so as a result, what happens is like the trust on just like the whole say commerce bit and all for the shopkeeper as well as the customers just vanishes, right? So I mean, so it's not like easy to make this trust, right? I think it'll take quite a bit of time, but that's one. And as I said, like I think just like increasing the overall accessibility of the ecosystem, whether it's better fulfillment experiences by logistics or whether it's just like better localization of products or just like them feeling that they can reach out to customer support for help, right? Which is like be anything. I think it's just like all a matter of the customers feeling comfort, right? Because you're asking them to make a major behavior shift. So that usually comes about only when people are very comfortable, right? So I think like trust is going to be the first and the biggest problem that like all of these startups have to solve for.
How does a startup build trust? Like, what do you think are good examples of companies which have stayed afloat for a while, built trust, and became profitable?
Okay, so I'm not sure like if there's a company that's like covered or actually, I mean, as far as like Nisho is a good example, to be honest. Like as I said, like they just like posted their first profitability quarter, right? So I think they're a great example of how to do that. So I think in the last like year or so, they've just like stayed there. Make sure they optimize their org as much as possible, make sure they focus as much as possible, and I think the results there for everyone to see, right? And I think it's just like if it's just about building trust, if I take a different example, right, I think credit is a great example of that, right? Like I mean, not yet profitable, but how they started with just helping people pay their credit card bills, and now the kind of upselling they do across e-commerce and like everything, right? They've become an e-commerce discovery channel now.
Yes.
So I think that's I mean, like now I can go to Cred's app, and if I want to buy something, like I mean, I'm not going to think a lot about it now, right? Because like I trust Cred, right? Because like all of like pretty much like all of my like a lot of my payments flow through that essentially. So I think there are a few examples of like companies who have built trust. The common thing is that it takes time.
Makes sense. Awesome. Takes on report the report page 42. There's a slide about narrative violation. It suggests that a sharp drop in the frequent user base growth and the brutal power law.
Yeah.
So looking at that, is it very tough to build a consumer social platform in India, like especially for Indians, and why is it so?
Okay.
Left, right, MX, Takatak, and a bunch of other guys. So is it tough?
So to your point, it's tough. Yes. Right. I think. So let's think about it like in terms of like a comparison, right? Which you also talked about in the report. Sure. If you take Snap example, right? Like Snapchat's example, they earn a lot more money per average user in the US. I think like almost 8 times of that like that they do in India, right? I think actually the correct comparison was they earn roughly 8x of the money that ShareChat earns per user in India. Right? So it's a big difference. Essentially, when you say like is building a company tough, I'm going to look at it from the viewpoint of whether that company can make sense financially, right? Might not be making sense now, can do it in a few years or not, right? So from that perspective, is it tough making a consumer social company? Yes, because typically the business models have been around ads, have been around maybe enabling some sort of commerce through it or in-app purchases, right? I think that's about it. Just because the spending power is a lot more in US as compared to India, you will see more in-app purchases there and you will see more ad revenue there as well, right? Sure. And it's not the same in India, right? So inherently, that's what I think it makes it tough to build such a business in India. But again, like, I don't think it can be done, right? Like, I also tend to think of, say, for example, casual gaming companies who enable people to chat and something like that. Also in the same
Fidget,
category,
right? Have you
right?
heard of Fidget? FIGIT.
FIGIT, no, I haven't.
It's a very new one. It's
Okay.
Started from I think from the BITS Goa campus.
Okay.
Those are the buildings.
So is it the like it's got like random games where, say, for example, Enon is like
something like
Angry Bird and I've seen it.
You're talking about those type of companies.
Correct. So I mean, so that could be one, or like, I mean, you even have companies like Zupi, for example, right? Like, so it's all casual gaming. So if you would have played like trump cards in your childhood, right? So they've got a game on that. You've got Real Money Ludo, you've got Real Money Snakes and Ladders, all of those games, right? They're profitable. They're like like great margins, by the way. But I mean, like, the kind of distribution they have now, they can use it to like pretty much do anything they want, right? They can actually also start off like different business verticals using that same distribution. So I think it can be done. I think it just like depends on the category. People in India 2 and 3 tend to just like spend on different categories, right? They will either be spending on things which are very crucial to our livelihoods, education, healthcare, things like that, or they might be spending on their discretionary spend, however small, might be on things like casual gaming, right? Rummy and like all of these games have been around in India for a long time, and like cash-based games, right? So Zupi is just like essentially, or like any real money gaming company, it's just like tapping into that behavior, right? And they're very profitable ventures, by the way. So I think it just like depends on the category right now, but those categories can change. As I've been saying, I think it just needs time. We might see a lot of these categories turning profitable in the future.
Let's say you're building like a hyper exclusive platform for, let's say, a very niche industry, which is specifically targeted for India one.
Okay.
What fields do you think are relatively unexplored in those fields? Like, for the most part, I just looked at a app. I forgot the name. It's for booking parties, essentially, like booking passes, booking tables and stuff like that. Because apparently Dino takes a lot of cut, and these guys are like, we just take 5% or something.
Right.
So, is there any other unexplored field which is in your head and you aren't seeing a lot of traffic on it?
Unexplored fields.
Something like just first world problems, like which India one people might have, which require a very specific solution.
If it's a first world problem, like it's most likely solved for by someone or the other.
Sure, makes sense.
In my view, right? Like, I think like typically, I think like many of the easy problems have either been solved or they're being solved for. I think like the next gen of entrepreneurs have to solve like a very different set of like intricate problems, which like will only come to the fore like once the founder spends a few years working in that industry or something like that, right? I think those are the kind of problems which are like yet to be solved at all. But I mean, otherwise, like most of the problems that you might think about, I mean, like even something like parking in India, for example, right? Like, I mean, you've got companies around that too. You've got companies around, as you said, like just like you've got companies which can help you conduct house parties. Right? They'll bring all the stuff. You just need to book through them, and then like they'll bring food, they'll bring games, they'll bring everything. You've got companies which help you book specific tables in certain clubs or pubs or something else. You've got companies that help you book venues to play sports. You've got companies to help you book e-bikes, right? I mean, there's like
everything is almost
exactly right. So I don't think there's a lot of like consumer first world problems which are like yet to be solved in India, because if it's a first world problem, it's coming, like, I mean, a part of that would have been seen in the West, and if it's been seen in the West, there's a very good chance someone has tried to translate that problem in India.
Interesting, very interesting. Have you heard of Goa Getter by any chance?
Who?
Goa Getter.
Goa Getter?
Yeah,
no.
It's like a Goa Getter is like a platform where you just pay them a certain amount. You go to Goa, any club you want. You have a table. It's like a, I don't know what it's called. It's like a master key to wherever you want to go.
Oh, that's very
Things
interesting.
Like this. Yeah. Are you a Goa person?
Yeah, absolutely.
How often do you?
Once every year.
That's fine. Maybe you can check that out, because awesome. Okay, so let's get back to VC a little bit. What do you think is going wrong in the VC ecosystem? Like from the bird's eye view, especially working in the VC space. What do you think is going wrong?
So I'll maybe just like take the freedom of trying to frame that question in a different way.
Sure.
And I don't think there's a lot of stuff that's going wrong. I think just like to an outsider, what might seem like is different with the VC industry right now, right? And the most prominent, I think, observation there, in my view, is the lack of capital that we've seen, and lack of capital, and the lack of like more Series A, Series B, or like unicorns being minted out, right? I think that's the difference that's been there from like the latter part of last year to like right now, right? So what's important to understand is that for most startups, if you're talking about like seed stage capital, right, a lot of that can also come from just India, right? Whether it's Indian based VCs or something else. As you start needing more capital when you go to a Series B or a Series C or a Series D, you need more and more capital. And right now, most of that capital is concentrated outside India, right? What happened in 2020 and 2021 was that when the US Fed also like slashed rates to like near zero,
yes,
they've always had a lot of capital. We just thought like, okay, like, I mean, might as well just like invest this somewhere good, right? And India just seemed like a very like glowing, beaming opportunity to everyone, right? So which is why there was a sudden influx of capital, right? And perhaps like all that capital did not even like correctly understand what problems are to be solved in India, or like what is the like, I mean, what seems like a reasonable market size of various things in India, and so on and so forth, right? So you saw a lot of capital that came in, and suddenly you saw like so many unicorns which were being minted, right? But now when like things have started to roll back, right, you suddenly now see cases where I mean, like, so because the capital still comes from outside, you're not seeing as much active deployment, right? Simply because like if there's a company that's like, I mean, that raised a Series C, say in 2021, right? They have to, there's a very good chance that that company might just like have raised ahead of its potential back then, right? Because like there was just an influx of capital.
Yes.
So they have to cover up for that distance. Secondly, they also need to cover up for the distance between like a Series C and a Series D, whatever makes sense in their business, right? It's a lot of things to do. And unless companies can do that, there is not going to be another round that happens, right? And that round will not happen from India. It will mostly come from outside. So I think that's where the VC industry is tightening up. If you look at it in terms of numbers, seed funding from 2021 to 2022 only sort of, I mean, not only, but just like it shrank by around 25%. But growth capital, which like comes beyond Series A or like later, like same like later growth stage, that shrank by 50%, right? So it's a big amount. It came down from roughly 32 billion to 16 billion. So like, I mean, and you see
not a lot of capital flowing this time.
Exactly, right? So I think that's what's different with the VC ecosystem right now. And I don't think it's wrong or anything. It's just that now you've got like a whole batch of startups who've got to like live up to their potential, justify like their valuations and everything, and then the normal journey resumes from there, right? And again, this will take time and patience. So it just like feels like a little bit of limbo right now.
Sure. So was that a lot of like vanity metrics? Like, was that what was happening back in the day, like 2021? And what led to the funding winter in 2022? Like, why was it so difficult to raise capital?
Yeah. So I think, so to your point, like, so I don't think like no company like chases vanity metrics, right?
Really? That's what I like gently talked about on Twitter, and that's what brings impressions.
No, I mean, so okay, I think like two ways to think about all of these, right? Like one is like, I mean, always as an outsider, what maybe like you and I can think of is that, okay, like, oh, they were chasing these metrics, this is how they picked up their money and so on and so forth, right? But like, I mean, if you think of all of it from the perspective of founder, more often than not, I believe the founder will be thinking about the company's sort of like long-term vision, right? And no long-term vision is based on just vanity metrics, right? So while that round might have been raised on some metrics which the founder might have said that, like, I mean, and as you said, like, a lot of FOMO was also back there in 2021, right? You've got one major global investor who's putting in money, the other one also wants to put money in, right? So they want a competitive player who like comes up in that category and all of that. So so FOMO or like conviction, like you can call it any which way, also played a role there. But I think like at that point in time, at a specific point in time, it might have seemed that like, hey, we don't think that this company's metrics are what it needs or what it justifies like this sort of a round right now. But we're sure they can get there, right? Because we think the Indian market is this big, we think the founders can do all of this, and so on and so forth, right? And I mean, 2020, 2021, a lot of things were changing, right? Like, I mean, people thought, okay, like remote is the future of work, right? But like, I mean, it doesn't really seem like that. Exactly, right? So a lot of things haven't played out the way people thought they would. So which is why it just like feels right now that, hey, there's a lot of promises that are unfulfilled. There's a lot of potential that still needs living up to, and that's what's resulting in like what we can call as the funding winter, right? But the way I see it, I think it's just that I mean, the fundamentals of like doing business should not change, right? Or like they will not change essentially. So if it's about like raising money or something else, it'll always, I mean, at some point or other, like things will normalize. They will have to be raised at metrics which make sense. They will have to be raised at the company stage that makes sense, and so on and so forth, right? So I think like all of that will just like take a little bit of time adjusting to, but I don't think that like normalcy will never return, right? Or like you will not again see a year where you will see 20 unicorns being minted. That might just happen again in the next 2 to 3 years. It's just like not happening right now.
For sure. Okay, so let's get to AI because that's booming on Twitter for now, and everybody's talking about AI.
Yeah.
So as a VC yourself, like, where do you see this going? Like, do you think this is something which will actually change lives, or is it just like the Web3 hype that just happened and just died out? Like, at least for the most part.
Okay, so so just like one sort of like clarification, I don't look at AI based startups, right? So I'll tell you like what my like layman view is. I think AI is here to stay. Essentially, it's sort of, I mean, a good measure of that would be just seeing like how much it is already starting to get mixed into how people do their work, right? Or and like, I mean, as soon as you see like, I mean, some bit of techno, so let's compare it against virtual reality, for example.
Okay.
Right? So people are still not
adapting to
VR as much, or VR has still not gotten mixed into people's usual actions of their daily life as much.
Sure.
Right? Even to like, I mean, like someone sitting in Bangalore as much, right? Like, I mean, like, if it comes to VR, for example, I think that like, hey, I need like perhaps like an Oculus or something else, just like you will experience it fully, right?
Sure.
But AI, I can just like, I mean, I experience it like on a daily basis, right?
Sure.
So I think just the extent to which it has gotten mixed in our lives is very different, right? So what that means is like the sooner and the more it gets mixed into my daily things or like in my daily life or the way I do things, I think like it is as irreversible a change, right? So from that perspective, I think AI is here to stay. Now, whether in like it's or I mean like the kind of different startups that we see, right? I don't think that like all of them are, say for example, if someone is just building a startup which is once it's just building, like I mean everything takes effort, but like if someone's building a startup which is based on just like a layer of AI and it's being packaged into something else,
just
right?
Like a wrapper on top of a
exactly, right?
Sure.
I don't think it's a very strong defensible thing.
It's not,
right? So, but if someone is building an infra layer or something like that, right? Or like, I mean, something that will be used in turn by everyone else. I think like those things will definitely be here to stay, right?
Sure.
So, I think it just like depends on what like how someone is using it or how someone is applying it. But I feel like this change is like here to stay.
Yeah. How often do you use AI in your day to day?
For me, it's not that much, to be honest. I mean, like in my interaction with like all the apps that I use and everything, I think like AI plays a fair enough role, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But in my work, I don't think it's that much. There's not a lot of things in my work that I can just like absolutely replicate, right? But like, I mean, if I just have to talk about like my peers, for example, right? I know people who've switched to like Chat GPT instead of Googling as like their primary source of information, right? If they just like there's a fair bit of inaccuracy there.
It hallucinates a lot sometimes.
Right. Yeah. But I think like if you need is just like a directional sense to get things going, it's good enough.
Right. It's pretty cool because for the most part, what I do is I just have like a Chrome extension. I just press Ctrl+Shift+K, which is usually the key for searching anything, and just do that and open ChatGPT, whatever I want. So for the most part, if I'm writing like let's say if even if it's an assignment or whatever, I just put in pointers and it's like elaborate this, and it gives me whatever. And then there's certain really interesting wrappers which are built on top of ChatGPT, which is it's one called Chat with PDF.
Okay.
Right. So it's also pretty cool. So you can push any PDF into it. I mean, not the ones with like images and stuff. It can't read images. From what I know, it's based on vectors.
Okay.
So so it just looks at the text information. It sort of gives you an overview. It hallucinates as well, but because PDF बहुत बड़ा रहता है,
correct,
too much information.
Yeah.
But if that's sort of if it progresses, I mean, it just replaces a lot of jobs. Yeah. And as cliche as it may sound, do you think jobs are safe in the next 3 years? Let's take 3 years because a lot of like 10 years may have, but let's take 3 years. What do you think is going to be replaced, and what should people be worried about?
So the short answer is like, I mean, jobs will adapt, right?
Really?
To like just like I think they'll be worked out in a different way essentially. So will some skills be absolutely taken over? I think so. Yes. If, for example, there is, I mean, just like a very simple example, right? Like if there's a very basic level of customer support that's needed, that will be taken over, right?
Sure.
By AI, right? Those jobs will go. So I think like people I mean, those sort of jobs might be a little bit hit where just an initial bit of accuracy or directional sense is needed, or where tasks can get completed just by like choosing between certain options.
Yeah, right? Like if there's already a pre-existing documentation for a SaaS and I want to achieve XYZ, and if I just put a problem, it just finds that.
I mean, a much simpler example. Like if I'm ordering food from Swiggy. If there's something which is wrong with the order, for example, right? Just like I think, like their chatbot can just like help me deal with it instead of like me dealing with a customer care executive, right? It is escalated if like, I mean, I'm not satisfied with the response, right? That still happens. But maybe like, I mean, some initial bit is covered already by AI, right? So I think jobs as of now will get affected to like various degrees, right? I think like, I mean, any job that like still requires some bit of like human element or like thinking, which is like not based purely on information that's available out there, I think those are safer. But in a short way, I think like all jobs will have to adapt, right? I mean, I know it's not like about the jobs that pay less or pay more, right? There are various trading desks which can just like be like which already are automated, right? Like I mean, like those companies don't need a lot of like active traders sitting there and like, I mean, working with them right now, because their models can do all of the work, right? So I think like jobs have been adapting from like quite a bit of time, but just like now because of AI, we see its use and its impact widespread, right? So that's where like most of the questions are now coming from.
How similar is this to the Industrial Revolution?
It's a good comparison. Increases efficiency for sure. And I mean, I think you need more energy, like literally more energy to keep all of this running. So that's also there. And like I think good example, because of that, just like jobs will have to evolve or like will have to adapt, right? It's not like, I mean, jobs were wiped out because of the Industrial Revolution. They just changed their nature, right? And I think the different kind of jobs will always be created, but I think the bar for what seems like a job that needs a human to do, I think that will keep evolving, right? Not necessarily higher or low, that will keep evolving, right?
Do you think it will go lower?
I don't know. Lower than before. Like, I mean, sure. Like, if AI can help you a little bit in like what you're doing right now, like I don't think it can go lower.
Internships will be easier. That's what I say.
Sorry.
Internships will be easier.
I don't think so, man. I mean, I don't like look at internships as like, I mean, like work which is easier to do. It's just like, I mean, different interns of different kinds, right? Like, I mean, there might be like a more repetitive work in some interns, but I'm sure like other interns are like also like very, very open-ended, right? Like if you go an intern with like a very young startup, for example, there are no repetitive things to be done there, right? So I think just like very, very contextual, all of it. But everything will have to adapt.
Sure. Yeah. What do you think about the semiconductor industry?
Semiconductor industry, I mean, so I think comes from 2-3 different things, right? Like one, because a lot of it is controlled by ARM right now, like the whole supply chain, which is based out of Taiwan and China trying to take control and everything. So like companies are suddenly thinking that like, hey, we also need to de-risk our supply chains there, right? That's one. Secondly, I think from what I know, again, not an industry I look at, but like, I mean, essentially different models which like make use of like the whole thing, like whether it comes to making chips and like the kind of programs that run there. There is also a movement towards like a few open source approaches there, right? Like I think there is one model which is the RISC model, which is like an open source model, right? So now suddenly you will have a lot more innovation happening there, right? And to fuel that innovation, you also need to take care of the semiconductor supply chain industry, right? So I think because of that, a lot of de-risking will start to happen again. And more and more AI comes in, you will need heavier compute and all of that, right? So I think people will have to find ways to make sure that like, I mean, it does not really become a blocker. Like a good example would be like as it became a blocker for Indian automobiles in like the last 2 years or so, right? There was a shortage of semiconductors which are coming in from different parts of the country, and hence the waiting times of like new vehicles just like shot up.
Everything shot up. Even computer parts, everything.
Exactly. And just like if I just like talk about automobiles, right? Because the waiting times of newer automobiles shot up, people still wanted automobiles, right? So they switched to new like second-hand cars, and the price of second-hand cars hence also went up, right? So multiple reasons, but this was definitely one of the reasons, right? So I think like, I mean, people will have to solve for this, and whether it's just like AI or more of AR VR use cases coming in, you will have more and more companies spending there. So I think like, I mean, you will need more and more of this, right? And like AR VR also represents like a very, very different platform shift.
Sure. It's like everything is different.
Exactly. I mean, like you can just like almost think of it as like, I mean, how
the world basically,
how Apple and Microsoft seeded like the ecosystem like back in 80s and 90s, right? It's perhaps that sort of change.
For the most part, you can essentially have a workspace on your head. Like that's what someone built it in F.inc. Do you know what F.inc is?
Yeah.
So they built something like that. They took the headset and essentially they just had like screens here and there.
Right.
And there was just like one laptop basically acting as whatever, and that's what was happening.
Yeah.
So essentially it's like it's a different world. So do you think the metaverse dream still exists? Do you think Mark Zuckerberg will be proven right at some point?
So I have view. So I mean, to be honest, like as much as I've tried to understand it, I don't yet know what the metaverse is. Like I can't like come to define it very properly, right? It could just be like one definition could just be like, okay, maybe any universe is a metaverse, right? Like if I browse Instagram, that's also a metaverse for me.
Sure.
Another definition could just be that, I mean, if I think about my physical senses, right? Sight or smell or like hearing or anything else, can I translate those senses into a different world, right? Maybe that's the definition of metaverse. So I don't know what it really is, and like because I don't know what it really is, like I don't know what the dream is and all of that, right? But I do think as like part of the whole AR VR sort of like platform change, it is definitely something that is like, I mean, out there. It will take time to sort of like, I mean, for like us to properly see any of it, right? Because as with like any platform change, you need like a lot of things to happen, right? You need to solve for technological issues, right? Which means like hefty R&D costs. You need to seed an entire ecosystem of developers in that field, right? Which is again like a huge cost.
Right.
You need consumer adoption to take off, again a huge cost, right? So all of these things typically take like years and years to like eventually come about. Like an interesting statistic, the number of VR headsets sold last year was close to 20 million globally, right? That was also the number of iPhones Apple sold back in 2009.
Oh, okay, fine.
Close to 20 million, right? So now you see like how far that has come up along. Who's to say this can't?
Makes sense. Have you tried VR?
I have tried, but like but just like not in an extensive way.
Are you a gamer by any chance? Like,
No,
never played games.
No,
you should try VR games at least once in your life, because it's a different experience. Like, have you watched Black Mirror?
I've seen Black.
Yeah, so the episode where what's his name?
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, so it's almost like that. Like, it's literally you're in another world. Like,
correct.
It's insane. You should try that. Okay, so as a physics major, do you know what happened in South Korea, the LP-99 situation?
No, I don't.
You don't?
No.
Okay, so the thing is, turns out there's like a report that has been leaked. It's I forgot the paper. There's like
are you talking about the semiconductor thing?
Yeah, the superconductor.
Yeah. Correct.
What do you think about that? Like, do you think it's true? What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, it seems outlandish. If it does come about, then it's so many good things for the world.
Yeah.
But I don't know yet. I mean, like whether it's true or not. Speculations can only get us so far.
Sure.
I mean, I hope something comes out of it. But
so, as a physics major, what do you think will change if the LP-99 situation is true?
Okay, so let's try and think basics, right? Essentially, what do you need a superconductor for? Okay. So one, what it currently takes to make a superconductor, and two, what it is it used for, right? So it's used in any situation where you want you want the resistance to any bit of energy or electricity flow to be as less as possible, right? For that to happen, you need a superconductor, right? Which is where you have extremely low resistance. To get to that state, as of now, the only method is to cool down any material
0 Kelvin.
To, as low as possible. 0 Kelvin is not attainable, but the few examples that we have right now are close to 4 Kelvin, right? It takes a lot of energy to get things to that state. And using that state, then you try and power a few features, right? But what that means right now is that the whole superconductor application is pretty much energy-wise, not feasible, right? You have to spend more energy to eventually get some use out of it.
Sure.
If this happens, what might essentially end up happening as a result is that you will spend much lesser energy to get to a superconducting state, because you can do this now at room temperature, and then you have its applications, right? So now all of it just becomes energy-wise feasible. So think about, say for example, magnetic levitation, right? Trains, right? A lot of energy right now is wasted because when these trains, even if it's a metro, for example, right? When they go on rail tracks, there's a lot of friction, a lot of energy has to be put into it just to keep the speed same, right?
Sure.
But if you have levitation and there's nothing between them, then you need to put in a lot of energy to run the trains,
sure.
right? That can be possible if you have superconductors, right? So this is like a whole different world, which can just the whole different world, right? If you can just make that happen. So it's a major breakthrough if it's true. But let's just fingers crossed.
So for the most part, it is not. That's what you're thinking.
I don't know yet. I don't know. I would like to be optimistic in this case.
Have you read the paper? Is it really out or not? I believe the abstract was leaked or something.
Yeah, the abstract was leaked. Yeah. So which is why I don't know. Which is why
produce it randomly.
That's true. But the physicist in me is hoping for it to be true.
Yeah. Where does the physics mind and the investor mind, where do they confluence? Have you seen the merger of those two skills, and how has it benefited you ever in your job?
Interesting question. I think so. Not in terms of specific tech, but I think it does come into use when I think where I've found a confidence so far is just first principles thinking, right? I think so physics, because all of the problems that you try and solve, right? You have to start up from the absolute basics in terms of how electrons behave, or just some very basic things, right? And from there you start getting in various assumptions and all that, and then you try and solve specific problems, right? But you have to be very strong with this first principles approach, essentially trying and boiling down any problem statement into one, multiple different parts, and two, just getting down to the absolute bare bones of all of those problems, right? I think that's a good skill to have in investing as well, because if you look at any investment is any startup, basically it just runs on a multitude of things, right? But whether you can just break down all of those into different problem statements to try and understand the industry, how the company is doing, how various parts of the company are doing, and then try to get to the bare bones of it. I think it's a good skill to have, right? I think that's a place where I found a confluence of both of these things.
That's pretty interesting, because sometimes I feel that chess and me learning how to code, sometimes it makes sense, because chess is a lot of patterns, and for the most part, if you look at chess, at least at the highest level, there's nothing new. Like if you look at a randomly, it's almost always been played before.
Yeah.
And with code is almost like that, because if you try to solve one specific coding problem ever, it's obviously been done somewhere.
Yeah.
And you can just look it up on Stack Overflow, and it's almost similar.
Interesting.
Something just to add to that.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So now we're almost at the end of the conversation, and this is where all the founders are waiting for, right? So it's how to approach an investor. What's the right way? Like if you're applying, not applying. Like basically, if you're pitching, what's the right way to do it?
Okay, so multiple ways to do it. I think just like varying degrees of success, right? I think one of the best ways is to, like, if you don't know the person directly, is to get a warm intro, right? So for example, like if you're a founder who's building in a certain space, like a great way to pitch to an investor is to see if you can get in touch with any of the other portfolio companies that the investor works with, right? Because I have invested in them, I know them very well, and if they're coming and telling me like hey, here's this great guy, or like hey, here's this like a great founder and she's doing this, and so all of that, then you should like have a look, right? I think it's like one of the more compelling ways for any VC. I think that's got to be the best. And just like then in general, I think just like getting intros from anywhere. If it's not like a warm intro, I think getting intros from anywhere, that helps. There might also be people who I might not know, but like they're just like good in their fields, right? Like for example, you will now have a lot of founders who are also doing angel investing. And they might have invested in some startup, and they might just like refer that founder to like a VC, right? That's also a good way to pitch to them. Then I think so. These are like two very good short ways. Then it really depends like from case to case on like a very contextual basis, right? So some founders also just like cold reach out to investors, right?
Does that pan out well?
Sorry?
Does that pan out well?
It depends really. It's not like so. As I said, like very contextual, right? I think like different people like just behave in different ways. If you're going to mail like cold reach out to Andreessen Horowitz, right? Maybe he might not just like reply, right? But like someone else might. Who knows?
Sure.
So I think that's that. Like plus like I think like now like there's like you've got almost every VC on something like a Twitter or LinkedIn or somewhere else, right? Like so also just like cold reach out there. So multiple means. But I think just like intros are like one of the best ways to reach out.
Sure. So what not to do? What annoys you like as a VC? Like if a founder does X, like what is that X? Okay. So just like very honestly speaking, I think like there's like no annoying things or like turn-offs as such. And I think like it's also got to do with like how Blume is as a company. So like we have like a special place for empathy for founders, right? So like we never like have this sort of thing that like, oh, what's this guy doing, right? However, I think like if there's anything that comes close to it is the founder not having, or perhaps like the founder being in love more with the solution rather than the problem statement, right? How are they different?
Okay, so think about this. So there might be 5 different ways to solve a problem.
Sure.
Right? If I really have to spend my time, my efforts, my money on it, I might as well, if I like a problem statement, right? And for that problem statement, if I try a definite solution, right? If it doesn't work, I'll move on to something else, or something else, or something else, right? If it comes to like me investing in a certain founder, I would want the founder to just like keep fighting as much as they can, right?
And find the most ideal solution.
Exactly, right? Because like we believe in problem statements. If the founder loves the solution more than the problem statement, if the solution doesn't work out, then what does the founder really turn to? Right? But if the founder loves the problem statement, even if the solution doesn't work, they can still turn back to their motivation for the problem statement, right? And try and figure out a different solution, right? So I think that's the only thing which at all like comes close, because if the founder loves the solution more than a problem statement, it's not like the founder will fail, but it might just mean that they might be a very, very long struggle.
Yeah.
Right. The founder might get somewhere. The founder might even succeed very heavily, right? But it might just be like a long struggle.
Very interesting. Awesome. Okay, so this is a cliche ending that I do on every show, right? So any last bit of advice you want to give to our listeners, to aspiring founders, to actual founders looking for funding, looking to build things that they love?
I think just like one. I think just like hear people out, right? I think listening is a very important, like a very and a very underrated skill. I think a lot of times VCs, founders, operators, whoever, right? I think they miss out on just like picking up a lot of insights or just like any bit of hints just because they're not listening as much, right? But I think like just like making sure you're as much aware and like you give proper or just like you focus a lot on what people are saying. I think like distilling that is just like going to help you in the long run, right? And you might like pick up things from anywhere, to be honest. I was just like watching this video where I think it was Tanmay Bhatt who just said that like he first bought Bitcoin because he heard it in a Punjabi song. So I mean it's things like these, right? So I think just like listening, listening is like one of the things that like I think just like is there right up there for me.
Makes sense. Thank you so much, Amal. It's been a great time.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. So we can cut.